Hello, everybody. I'm Emma, and we're here to talk about Dublin Core for Omeka this evening. Just first off, Backlog is the name of my company, and Backlog is hosting this webinar. Jen is also with us, and she'll introduce herself in a second, and she put this together. Backlog is based in St. Louis. We're an archival consulting firm. We work with some small museums and archives in the area to help them set up some digital archives. We also do genealogy research, and we specialize in the Midwest, but we've taken on some national projects. It's just kind of, we can get really deep into things that are here in St. Louis. So we do archival consulting. We've written policies and procedures for a few places. We've put together unique databases for unique places like the City Museum. And then we also do genealogy research. We've helped a couple of people this month find documentation for citizenship applications. So people who are in different parts of the country, yet like their grandparents had stopped and gotten married in St. Louis, and they needed us to find that documentation. Yeah, and I'm Emma. Backlog is my company. I founded it in early 2021. I was laid off after, like during COVID, summer of 2020. And then I've kind of found that a lot of places need a little bit of help, but not help full time. So we've kind of been able to fill in some gaps at different institutions. I'm the dedicated archivist for St. Louis University High School and the St. Louis Media History Foundation. And those are places where they just need like one morning a week to have somebody on site to help with volunteers and train and make sure everything's up to archival standards.
And hi, I'm Jenna Duplessis. So I'm out here on the East Coast. So I work for a nonprofit organization, and I previously worked for a university where I was the sole archivist for almost 9 years. So I'm used to kind of doing everything and figuring stuff out as I go along. So I think I'm a pretty scrappy archivist, and I think a lot of archivists are in that same position. So my background is I have a Master of Science in Library and Information Science from Simmons University with a concentration in archival management. And I also have a Master's in History from Simmons.
So just a few things. We'll do a Q&A at the end. So just, if you'll hold off your questions till the end, and then the recording will be emailed and we'll to everybody in the morning. We'll put it up on YouTube. And then Jenna, if you could put the link to, yes. There's a handout that kind of gives a lot of resources. And we'll put that in the chat, but then that will also be linked in the YouTube recording description. So if you can't find things. Okay. And with
this
that,
way you don't have to remember URLs. I'm like, what was that thing she mentioned? Was it a .org?
Totally. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jenna.
Thank you. So we're talking about Dublin Core today. Dublin Core is a standard for describing a variety of resources. It's designed to be super broad so that you can use the same standard to describe a photograph, a text document, a chair. And so the names and definitions of the metadata fields are necessarily broad. There are 15 standard fields that we're going to go over all of them. And there are some variations on Dublin Core. There are extended versions, versions that are designed for different disciplines, but we don't need to worry about that today. And unless you have a really specialized institution, you don't need to worry about that just yet. We're going to just focus on the basics. Next slide, please. So it's named after Dublin, Ohio, not Dublin, Ireland. So that is the home of OCLC, which is a library organization. It was first developed in 1995 at OCLC, and it has been adopted by the International Organization for Standardization as ISO 15836. So it's used world over. And next slide, please. So just a couple of definitions of things that I've started to mention already and will mention later on. You might be familiar with some of these terms already. So metadata is information about an informational resource. So, your text document, the letter that you're describing is your informational resource, and the metadata is the information about it, where it came from, its date, its author, what it talks about, its length, things like that. When I talk about the metadata field, that's where the metadata is going to go, whether in a spreadsheet or in the Omeka platform, whatever platform you're using, that's just where you're going to be entering the information. A catalog record or an item record is just the set of metadata for a particular object. So I use these terms pretty interchangeably, but a catalog record can be a physical card from a card catalog, or it can be you go on your public library website and you look in their catalog and you pull up a listing for a book, or it can be your Omeka record for a photograph. Those are all examples of catalog records or item records. And you may hear my cat scrambling because she's realized that I am on a call. The next slide, please. Omeka has a really general tag feature. That's just another metadata field. It can include all kinds of information. It can combine different types of metadata. So you can put things in like the content as well as the type or colors or people or the donor name, whatever. It's less structured, so it's kind of a bucket where you're putting all the information you can think of. We're not going to talk about that today, but that is because it's not part of Dublin Core, but that is an option depending on how you set up your Omeka. And a controlled vocabulary is the wall between us and chaos. It's a standardized set of descriptive terms. So the person who's describing an object can refer to a controlled vocabulary to ensure consistent description. So this is really useful to make sure that if you've got a bunch of different items that talk about the same thing, that they're described in the same way. So there might be multiple terms that actually describe the same thing or alternate spellings. When you are talking about people, if they have a pseudonym or a married name or a religious name. I used to work for a religious university, and there were a lot of, Sister Marys who had baptismal names. So they had multiple names throughout their lives. So a controlled vocabulary is something that can be standardized through a big organization like the Library of Congress, or is something that you can also develop in-house for your local resources. And we will get to all of that at the end. Next slide, please. So Omeka is a platform for hosting and describing digital cultural heritage items. It's open source, meaning that the code is available for developers to customize. If you have someone who knows how to code on your staff, you can really just take the Omeka code and make exactly what you want. But it's also, you can also have it hosted through Backlog, or actually Omeka has some hosting services itself. But the platform itself is free. You just have to pay for your hosting and maintenance services. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of different plugins in Omeka that you can add for adding adding narratives to a set of objects. So you can map them, you can create timelines, allow for user submitted transcription, lots of other things. And that's what you get in a community where you have open source software. People are able to come up with new ways to make it work. So we're not going to talk about the exhibit design function of it today. We're just going to focus on the metadata, but just know that this is kind of an option. Once you have your objects described, there are lots of other things that you can do with them. Next slide, please. So just some general guides for using Dublin Core, using metadata in general. Sometimes metadata terms will have commas in them, especially if it's someone's name. Mine would be Duplessis, comma Jenna. So if you have multiple terms that are all going to the same metadata field, like you have multiple authors, multiple subjects, separate them with a semicolon rather than a comma. It also, especially if you're converting to like a comma separated format in like a spreadsheet, it's good to use semicolons instead. You can format using HTML in some fields in Omeka, but that's not necessary. You don't have to think about, using paragraphs or anything like that. It really just depends on your organization's Omeka. And some of these elements, the the 15 standard elements will be easier to use than others. Some of them, like language or date, will be really obvious, and others will be more subjective. There isn't always a right answer to what you're entering for that metadata field, and that's okay. Next slide, please. So to kick us off, the title, what is your thing called? It might have an official title, or you might have to supply one. If you're composing the title, make it detailed and descriptive, and maybe even a little bit dry. For example, if you're describing an image of people who are walking down the street, use factual information about where they are, how many people are there, what's the weather, rather than like an artistic name like enjoying a spring day, because that doesn't help the person looking for that item. It's they're going to be searching for factual information. You might have multiple items with the same or similar titles, and that's okay. Especially if you've got, 46,000 photographs of the same event, which can happen. Yeah, it's okay if you've got very similar titles. The titles don't have to be unique. Next slide, please. But the identifier does. So an identifier has to be a unique value, but whatever that value is up to you. It can be a file name and the accession number for your museum database, some sort of internal item number, or you just start numbering things. If you've got a stack of 1,000 photos and you're like photo 0001, photo 0002, it just has to be unique, and it's good if it follows some sort of naming convention. But use your local standards and naming conventions. Next slide, please. So the creator is one of those really broadly conceived fields, simply because, for a book, you might have an author, but you don't necessarily have an author for a piece of furniture or a building. You have just a creator. So in library science, the creator is the party that is responsible for the creation. So for written work, this would be the author, but it could also be a photographer or a filmmaker, a musician. And creators can be individuals. You can have multiple individuals if something is, say, co-authored, or you've got a duo, 2 musicians. Or it can be a group that publishes or creates as a unit, and that's called a corporate entity. So that would be something like the University of Missouri, or the Library of Congress, or the name of your museum, or the Walt Disney Company. Those are corporate entities, and you can have multiple corporate entities, a combination of corporate entities and individuals. It really depends, and the differentiation between this field and the next field is pretty subjective. So just think about, well, who's the most responsible for making this object in the world? Next slide, please. So contributor is sort of a companion field to creator, and it describes people or entities, just like with creator, individuals or corporate entities that contributed to the creation, but were not completely creatively responsible for it. Again, this is a really subjective decision. Some possible examples would be like translators, editors, illustrators, and maybe like a cinematographer. Roles like that, if you feel that those particular individuals or entities have had some input in the shape of the thing that you're describing, but you don't want to cite them as creators. You don't have to use this field at all. If you want to throw everybody who's relevant into creator, you can decide to only have one creator and everyone else is a contributor. It's really subjective, and as we're going to get to at the end, really think about how your institution wants to make these decisions. Next slide, please. So the date should be pretty straightforward. It's the date of the creation of the final form of the item. So sometimes you'll have an item that's been marked up. It's got, you've got a letter that was sent on a certain date, postmarked on another date, and then someone wrote, like, stamped received, and then they wrote notes on it. So there are multiple dates. So think about, well, when did it become the thing that's in front of me? Not the earlier form. When did it become this particular object? So format your dates as shown in the slide. So it's 4-digit year, a little hyphen, not an M dash, not an underscore, hyphen, 2-digit month, 2-digit day. That's the standardized way we do that. It probably has an ISO number, which I do not know off the top of my head. Use as much information as you have. So you might not have the days. You might just know it was January of 1927. So you do 1927-01. That's fine. And you also might have approximate dates or date range, and you're not really sure. You might say 1960s or a range, a particular range of specific years. But decide as an organization how you want to deal with approximate date information, because it's going to be really annoying for a researcher to see the same period of time represented as like 1910 to 1913, before 1913, after 1910, and between 1910 and 1913. All the same period of time, but described in different ways. So that, could mess up their searches. The more words you have, the more possibility for error. So just have a local standard for how you want to think about approximate dates or using circa, things like that. Next slide, please. So the source field asks, where did this come from? Which we don't often know. And I'll give a small plug to my next webinar for items found in your collection, or you don't know where they came from. So the source is a sort of companion, or what's a good term? A good resource for citation. So you're going to record information here like Lee Family Papers, Box 5, Folder 7. It should be a roadmap to finding that exact item. So think of it like the scientific method. You want your experiment to be duplicatable. So in your citations, or when people cite your collections, they want to be able to point all of their readers back to the same document or photograph or whatever it is, so that they can see it for themselves and come to their own conclusions, hopefully the same conclusion. So it's, think of it like giving a page number for a book. And some institutions will use this field to note like the provenance of an item, like it was a gift of this certain person, or it was a museum purchase, or some foundation purchased it. I have seen that as well. But make sure that you say it's in some point in your metadata, in what collection this is a part of. Next slide, please. So in your description field, you can really be free. You can get creative here and describe what the thing is, as long or as short as you want to. Describe the visual content, the appearance, or other characteristics of the item in detail. You think about how you would help someone who maybe could not look at or touch or listen to the item understand it. So consider things like the presence of people and their actions, or actions of animals. I've been finding a lot of pet photos recently, so that's fun. You can talk about the landscape, the architecture, the sound quality, colors that are present, any damage or loss of information, whether that's visual or audio, the measurements of the item, or just any other relevant information. Maybe you might include some historical context. Just really provide all the information that that a person could find useful. But also at the same time, consider our 21st century perspectives and any assumptions or bias that we may have as catalogers that might creep into our description. For example, are we assuming that a woman is a nurse and not a doctor when we're describing a photograph? Note those things. What do we have evidence for, and what are we assuming? Make sure that there's visual or written evidence for description. And the description field is also where one should record captions on the backs of photographs or other accompanying information. And it's good to put this information in quotes and even say like caption, colon, quotes. And that differentiates between what information is part of the item, say was perhaps written by the photographer on the back of a photo, and what description is coming from the cataloger or the describer. Next slide, please. So type and format I'm going to talk about together because they're very similar fields in that they both talk about what is this? What is this thing that we're looking at? like what's the category of it, but there are some important differences. So the type talks about the sort of general genre or form of something. Is it a still image? Are they negatives, or slides? Is it a text, a moving image, sound, digital file, a combination of those things? Is it a digital image of a scanned slide? Whereas the format is a bit more specific because we're working with digital objects in this case. So it's going to be the kind of a combination. I usually use what's called a MIME type, M-I-M-E, and there's information about that in the handout. So MIME types include both generally like what the thing is it text, an image, whatever, as well as the specific file format. So if you're looking at a file, everything that comes after the dot, usually 3 characters, MP3, PDF, JPG. So you can kind of see in the slide a couple of examples, and there are many more types because there are so many different possible file formats. In both cases, controlled vocabularies are ideal. A couple of good ones are the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, as well as the list of MIME types. Those are both really important standards here. And the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus will define everything in the world. It like brings order to everything. You can find specific types of window sashes in there. So it's soothing to know that there's that much order in all of the chaos. So I definitely recommend checking both of those out if you're trying to describe what it is that you're looking at. Next slide, please. So the language will be what language or languages are present in the item. Pick a controlled vocabulary, again, because there are a couple of different international standards. So you might just be writing out the name of the language, so English, German, Spanish, but there are a couple of international standards that are abbreviations. So you might say English as EN or ENG, but also German won't be GER, it'll be like DEU for Deutsch. So decide as an organization which standard you want to use, and it might just be write out the name of the languages, and decide how you want to say that there's no linguistic content. It might just say none, you might just leave the field blank, because it's like as a sculpture, it doesn't have a language, or you might want to say no linguistic content. Just make that decision, and that will make things a lot easier for researchers. And next slide, please. So for your subject, or I should say subjects, because you should always have more than one, consider what a user might want to find that would lead them to this item. You're describing the content of the item. We've talked a lot about what the characteristics of the item itself, but now we're reading it or interpreting it, thinking about its particular cultural context, historical context. So think of how you want to describe what's in this item and similar items in the collection so that researchers can find all of those things, as broadly or as specifically as you see fit. And use at least one controlled vocabulary like Library of Congress subject headings, the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, or one that you develop in-house, like say a list of buildings for your campus. Because having wild subjects with no control will make it really hard for users to find similar items. And the subject field is different from the description field in that it's more researcher focused. So for example, in the description field, you might include that there's water damage to an item, but you're probably not going to include that in a subject field because it's very unlikely that a researcher is going to say, show me everything with water damage in this collection. So think about your researchers, think about your audience when you're adding subjects. Next slide, please. Coverage is kind of a weird one because it can be used to indicate the temporal coverage or the spatial coverage of the item. So temporal coverage would be phrases like Victorian era, early 20th century, or 1930s. And spatial coverage would be places like Missouri, Marceline, Missouri, Lane County, Missouri. Could be very broad, could be very specific. But once again, use a controlled vocabulary. A great one to use is the thesaurus of geographic names, which includes both like census designated places, like the name of a town, as well as like villages and some geographical features like streams and rivers. So you can get really specific with it. But just standardize the information in that field, because again, it's going to be annoying for researchers if the same place is described a bunch of different ways. So when they're searching, they're not going to necessarily get everything that should respond to their search. Next slide, please. So how you talk about publisher will depend on the item. If it's traditionally published or broadcast or distributed, then you will probably list an entity like a book publisher or a production company or something. But you can also use this field to denote the publisher of the digital record, which is your museum, your historical society, your library. It's really just dependent on your personal context. Next slide, please. Relation is a super vague field, and you can leave it blank. I mean, you can leave any of these blank, but relation is the one I think you can most safely leave blank if you don't have a use for it. Relation is used to describe how the digital object that you're describing relates to or represents the physical object. So you could say like detailed view of other item, for example. I often don't have a good use for it. I guess you could also include some collection information here. But yeah, it's defined in a super vague way. And because Dublin Core needs to be able to describe many different types of things. So, you could say, perhaps you've got a photograph of an architectural feature on a building. So you might use the relation field to say, this is a detailed view of a cornice on the northeast corner of this building on our campus, something like that. Is that everything I need to say about the super vague field that I have no good information on? Yes. Next slide, please. So rights is the field where you're going to talk about copyright. And I feel like copyright scares everyone. It scared me a lot when I first started out. It's tricky, but it's super important. So use this field to explain who owns the rights to this image or digital copy of this object, as well as how people can use it. So for example, you can say that something is in the public domain, which is everything in the world created before January 1st, 1928. Next year, we'll jump up to everything before 1929. So it's usually life of the author plus 95 years-ish. There were a lot of copyright law changes in the 20th century, which means some things are in the public domain that are newer than that. It's really like, don't worry about that right now. But you're going to say like, does my museum own rights to this? Because sometimes when a donor donates something, they also say, I am handing over the copyright. Or is the copyright still held by the publisher? Because this is actually just the cover of a book in our collection that's still, in print or was printed less than 95 years ago. And you can also specify how someone can use that. So you might say educational use only. Fair use is, I think it's subsection 108 of the copyright code. So that's, if it's educational use only, then if a student wants to use this particular image or sound clip in their PowerPoint, they can use that. There's also a really great resource called Creative Commons, which actually, sorry, that's on the next slide. Can we move forward one? So Creative Commons is not just designed for cultural heritage institutions. A lot of artists and creative people use it as well. So it was developed, I believe, at MIT. It's 6 standard license types. So you can say, this is in the public domain, use it however you want. You can say non-profit, non-commercial use only. You can also include what kind of attribution someone needs to give you. So that, I think it's a really good resource to check out, and it consolidates the mass of copyright options and information out there into 6 licenses. And so it can be a good place to start to make sure that you are serving yourself and the objects in your care with the correct licensing and rights. And I don't think I had anything. Yeah. Okay, sorry, next slide, please. So those are our fields. Those are the 15 fields. But as promised, I want to talk about documentation. Having a local processing guide, just going through each field and saying how you want to use it, is really valuable. And it will attend to the specific context of your institution and the people who will be doing this kind of work. So some things that you might want to cover in your internal documentation is how you want to format the approximate dates. Do you want to use title case versus sentence case in your titles? And there, I have an example at the bottom. You know, 2 people hiking in Tom's Sock Mountain Park in the autumn. You can put that in title case where you have lots of capital letters, or sentence case where it's just you only capitalize proper nouns and the first word in the sentence. It doesn't make a big difference, or really any difference, from a research standpoint, but aesthetically, if you are consistent, it will just look nicer. You can also think about how you want to format names, especially long names, religious names, married names, or anyone who did not use the same name over time. Names of your buildings, if you like, especially if you're a university or you have multiple campus buildings. And you can also point your catalogers to cultural guidelines for ethical description, like the anti-racist description resources, which are really valuable, and I personally think everyone should read. And you might also find other things that are specific to your institution that you want to specify, like really specific controlled vocabularies, or other aspects of your work that you want to point people to and have in your documentation. Next slide, please. So, we've gone through the 15 fields, but you don't have to set up your Omeka to follow Dublin Core exactly. You can add fields that are specific to your institution, or you can add fields from other metadata standards. A couple of examples are VRA Core, which is based on Dublin Core, but it's got a lot more fields and it's focused on visual resources, or Darwin Core, which again, based on Dublin Core, but it's focused on natural history. So depending on your institution, you might find other metadata standards that you want to borrow from. But these are the 15. These will get you started. And creating documentation for your employees and interns and volunteers on how to use these 15 fields will standardize your metadata even further, and will make these fields work within the context of your collections. So next slide, please. Okay. And I think, yes, yep. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about, and I should also add that, when it comes to Omeka hosting and consulting, these are services that Backlog provides.
Yeah. So next month in April, Jenna will be back and we'll talk about found and collection. Anytime we've taken a site visit, the number one thing, question I get asked is what do I do with this stuff that has no documentation? We don't know how it got here. We don't know who it came from. We don't know when it came here. And so we're going to kind of go over that, what do you legally need to keep? What does it mean when an item is accessioned into your collection, or if it's just in the building? So we'll really go over some technical things there, just because it's we're always asked it. And I learned
every single institution.
Myself. Yeah.
Sorry, I talked over you.
It's fine. I think there's a lag. But I'm looking forward to that. And then also in May, we're going to do one on the basics of finding aids. And so that's also at our website, backlog-archivist.com/webinars. And we'll do a Q&A in just a second. So these are some other webinars we've done this year. Inside Backlog's digital archive solution is just kind of a overview of what it looks like to do for us to host an Omeka or an archive space for you. And digital archive solution is just kind of talking about what these different platforms are and what is best for your institution. This fall, we did a different a preservation series where we went over paper, books, photos, and AV materials. And so those are kind of geared towards places with very small budgets and for people who just have family heirlooms that they want to keep. So those are all on our YouTube channel if you want to check those out. And then last month we hosted one on community collecting, and we went with Greg Kessler is a systems administrator with Backlog, but he founded a personal archive of his own. It's called the St. Louis Punk Archive. And we just went through the St. Louis Punk Archive as a case study for how do you kind of fill in a blind spot in your collection using grassroots outreach. And then a lot of kind of like catch and release scanning, which not all archives love, but it's really kind of an actionable way to fill in some blind spots. And Jenna's cat's saying hi.
Her name is Ellie. She's been howling, which I hope the recording did not pick up.
You're good. And then this is our contact information. My email is on here. It's emma@backlog-archivist.com. And if nothing else, just check out our next webinar. Jenna will be back and so will Ellie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to email us at hello@backlog-archivists, or go ahead and throw them in the chat or unmute yourself. We're ready to kind of break down all these fields. I always think that Dublin Core always sounds so much more complicated than it needs to, just because of its name. And so just having these really firm examples, I think will help. So the first question we have is from Susan, and is the Getty thesaurus more detailed than revised nomenclature? Jenna, do you know that?
Is that a separate controlled vocabulary? I'm actually not familiar with that.
I'm not either.
Oh, revised nomenclature is used. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Revised nomenclature is used largely in the museum field. It supports the past perfect database, which is used in a lot of museums and stuff. And it is that's where it's a naming convention. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not sure it the Getty Art and Architecture thesaurus might be more specific, but use whatever you're comfortable with. I'm used to using the Getty one because I did a big architecture collection in my last institution. Oh, Holly is saying that the Getty is much more robust. So thank you for adding your experience, because I have none with this one. So, and I also, I come from a strict archives background. So, and I actually just moved into museums. So, please expand on the topic racist. So I mentioned the anti-racist description resources. So these, I don't know if they've been adopted as a standard by the Society of American Archivists, but it's a way of thinking about, it's a resource that's really is almost like an essay or a manual for thinking about how racial bias sneaks its way into our descriptions. I think the best example, a really easy example is when we're talking about people who were enslaved, using person first language, so saying enslaved persons or enslaved workers rather than just calling them slaves. Call them people. And an assumption in library science is that a person should have a first name and a last name, but if someone was enslaved, we shouldn't automatically assign the name of their enslaver to that person if they did not choose that name. They may have adopted it themselves after the Civil War, but they might not. So to think more clearly about, and more carefully, I should say, more carefully and thoughtfully about sort of cultural marginalization and how we can grant greater dignity to people who've been marginalized within our within the descriptions of materials in our collections. I hope that answers your question.
Do we have any other questions, anything about Dublin Core or a specific field? All of the screenshots were from an Omeka we set up for the Walt Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline, Missouri. That's why Jenna mentioned like Marceline and Lynn County. And so we've got a case study on the website about how we set up an Omeka for them. And our coordinator there, he actually had a lot of great questions about all these different fields. And I was like, we need to record something for him because I'm explaining to him and he's going to take it back and then explain it to volunteers. But so we can kind of get that, directly connect with their volunteers, we should record something. And then I figured we should just, make a webinar out of it just so we can share the resource with everybody. And then Holly has another question. In use of Omeka, is it easy to graduate from the free version to paid hosting versions? Also, can you easily go from adding objects to Omeka to creating collections, or does that order matter? I think about going from the free version to the paid hosting version is you really want to start wherever you want your stuff to end up. So if we were to take somebody's free version and then to put it onto our servers, we would have to charge to migrate that data because that's labor on our end. And so you might be incurring more costs later on that you weren't thinking about.
Yeah. And I think if you're going completely through Omeka's hosting platform, that might be easier. But if you're moving to another organization hosting your materials, then that would like Emma said, would involve a server change. When it comes to creating collections, I believe you can, and I don't know if it's different between like the different types of Omeka. I think it's good to map out what your collections are going to be, how you're going to actually group your materials. But also, I mean, if you're just adding collection information to that source field and you're not necessarily trying to group things at the database level, then that doesn't matter. But you can also have collections and sub-collections so that in your Omeka, someone can just view what's in one collection. So I think it's good to at least map that out. I think you can still move stuff around once it's in Omeka, and correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, because I haven't quite tried to do it in the other order. But have a plan. I think it's fixable, but it's going to be more time consuming to try to to add that order later.
And also collections in Omeka should really, like the collection should really mimic or mirror what you physically have. And so if you already have collections set up that way, but then if we're talking about, moving items, you can create, exhibits that look like collections later after the items are in. Heidi, Holly, I'm sorry. I hope that answers your question. Good.
Yay.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm just going to make the joke that always has to, that I feel like all archivists have to make. Whenever you ask a question that has to do with archives, the answer is always, it depends. So that's why every answer is like, well, is there somewhere to find samples of standard procedures? You mean like examples of how other institutions do their documentation? Yes. I'm trying to, off the top of my head, I know that there are like big institutions like Harvard. They have an entire wiki on how they do their description. I mean, I can go look for them now, or actually I can definitely, sorry, I'm thinking multiple things at once. I know Harvard and Yale have really, really detailed descriptive examples. And I think if you just start Googling around, you will find those. But also I can try to pull those together. And if you shoot an email to the hello@backlogarchivist.com, then I can send all of that. Or I can go look for it now and Emma can vamp for a few minutes.
We can send it to you later. Yeah, just send an email to that hello email address, and we can provide those with you. And then also there's a lot of examples in the handout that we mentioned at the beginning.
And if you know people at other institutions that are maybe further along in their digitization and description journey, ask if you can have a copy of of what they give to their employees and interns.
And it's a lot of like what Jenna said at the end. It's all about documentation, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be consistent
to
your organization. And so it's
Yeah.
kind of, it's the consistency over perfection.
Yeah. I'm Googling Harvard Dublin Core Wiki right now. And I'm not getting what I want.
Yeah.
So if you send an email to the hello, then I will pull together a couple of those resources so you can see some examples. You can do both for Omeka. You can do individual objects where you just have sort of like a cataloging screen. And you can also do batch import with a spreadsheet.
We'll give it one more second if anybody else has a last question. These are all pretty good ones. Yeah. Okay. All right, well, with that, we're going to wrap it up. But Rebecca, if you'll just shoot us an email, and thank you, KJ, and thank you, Jenna. And we'll be back next month with the Founding Collection, and then back in May for the Finding Aid webinar. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. This is my first webinar. So thanks, appreciate it.